Tonight's topic is a very special topic that I believe is going to help many people that are today wondering, and even they may even be confused to a certain degree as to the role and methods and the final work of present truth. Our topic tonight is what went ye out to see? What went ye out to see? Which is, of course, taken from the book of Luke, chapter 7. And it is a tremendous admonishment and also rebuke that Christ gave. We want to deal with that and show from the scriptures, as well as referencing various spiritual prophecy quotes, the importance that you can see spiritually, you can see practically, you understand intellectually from the prophecy and the study thereof, how the work will finish, what method will be used, what type of ministry will be used, what type of ecclesiastical structures will be used to finish the work as the work was started and finished in Christ's day as a template. And also that you would not be deceived by those that aren't necessarily the priests and Pharisees and rabbis of our day, but those who should be giving the message in straight lines, even having a knowledge of reform, that are leading people in a wrong direction because they don't understand fully the true work for this time, no matter how sincere they may be. Let's start with just 2 points that I think will clear our mind and give us a good context and focus for our study before we allow Pastor Tim to even give us some thoughts. There are 2 points I think that very few Adventists will question if they are just even rudimentary students of the Bible and Spirit of Prophecy. Most of the Adventists will not argue from the Bible that John the Baptist prepared the way for Jesus' first advent. Most Adventists will not argue that. They have no argument with the fact that John prepared the way for Jesus' first advent, and that he was a messenger of the Lord to prepare ye the way of the Lord. There's virtually no argument, no contention, no misunderstanding or misapplication generally along those lines. Secondarily, most Seventh-day Adventists, especially those that understand the Spirit of prophecy to some degree, will not argue the fact that Seventh-day Adventists in our day, before the second advent, as Seventh-day Adventists, are called to do the same work that John did. There's almost no argument on those 2 points, virtually none. However, here's where the issue starts to arise among various groups and aspects of Adventism today. The question or issue is, who will give, or what is an honest, biblical, and Spirit of prophecy look at the various methods that were used by John the Baptist? What was the way in which John the Baptist did this work? What was the position of John the Baptist when it came to his recognition, his authority, his sanction by the ecclesiastical powers that be of the remnant church of his time? And how did he work in the connection or lack thereof of the visible church? How did he operate and do God's work of preparing a way for Jesus' coming when the visible church had an idea or a purpose or a mission statement that seemed directly opposite to his and viewed him as a threat? How do we honestly look at these things from the Bible and Spirit of prophecy? Here's where we have a tremendous need tonight of discussing some things. To do that, we'd like to look at 2 points. We're going to break it up in a way that we can digest it, and I'm going to have Pastor Tinsley, as well as I'm going to try and talk about some things as well, dialogue and unpack some of these thoughts that we can perfectly clearly see this work for this time in its biblical and Spirit of prophecy context for the finishing of the work. Point 1, we talk about this issue of lack of clarity on what methods, how did John the Baptist do this work? Jesus gave 2 rebukes that we would like to deal with tonight. 2 rebukes. Because the people of his day, the visible church of his day, the Adventists of his day, the remnant people of his day, did not see clearly this work that John the Baptist came to do and the method in which he was to do it. Jesus gave 2 rebukes. We're going to deal with those point by point. Firstly, we'll deal with this first rebuke, which is found in the book of Luke. Let's look at Luke quickly. Luke, the 7th chapter. Luke chapter 7, and let's see, Luke 7, and let's begin in verse 22. Well, as a matter of fact, Let's begin in verse 20. Luke 7 and verse 20. Let's give the whole context and then we'll narrow it down. In the book of Luke chapter 7, you probably do remember from reading this previously that John was in prison and was under great temptation of Satan and began to hold on to and act upon doubts that were placed in his mind concerning the ministry of Jesus. Because of this, and also the promptings of so-called close associates, even disciples, even some of his students, had to prompt his mind, the whisperings of Satan. And he sent a message to Christ, asking Christ whether he was truly him that was to come, whether this work that he had been doing was truly for him, or were they and John to look for another. Notice the statement here, and we'll get to the point in a moment. In Luke chapter 7, Luke 7 and verse 20, it says, "And when the men were come unto him, they said, John Baptist has sent us unto thee, saying, Art thou he that should come? Or look we for another?" We're going to come back to that in a moment. Verse 21, "And in the same hour he cured many of their infirmities and plagues, and of evil spirits, and unto many that were blind he gave sight. And Jesus answering said unto them, Go your way and tell John what things ye have seen and heard, how that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, to the poor the gospel is preached, and blessed is he whosoever shall be not offended in me." Now, the Spirit of prophecy clearly said this was a clear rebuke to John, that if he was to really doubt if this was the one, he was the one to come, Jesus, without even dealing with a theological rehashing or revisiting all the prophecies, he just showed him the gospel of health. He showed them the gospel work in health lines going forth and miracles being formed according to the scriptures, prophetic miracles that show that this was the movement that was to bring on the last revival movement of that age for the people of God. He told them, go your way, and blessed is he that hath no offense in me, because people were being offended. But notice that this set the stage for Jesus as they went their way to bring to the table a greater issue. And the greater issue was that these doubts and these lacks of spiritual vision, this lack of eye salve, was systemic. It was all throughout the church. And the people, the general people that were hearing the messages, did not have a clear understanding of John's ministry as opposed to the visible church, the denominational work, the ministry and leaders, and the various church-sanctioned manuals that put out and taught truth, the Sabbath school quarterlies. These things had their view and their idea of what truth was. And then John's work was completely different. And people were not able to separate this work that John was doing and the work that was going on in Jerusalem and in the visible church and on the regular lines and on the ways and means by which people were working. The people could not see. So notice what Jesus says in this first rebuke, which we're going to deal with, which is the topic, what when you have to see. Notice what it says in verse 24. Luke 7 and verse 24. Notice this now. In Luke 7:24 it says, "And when the messengers of John were departed, he began to speak unto the people concerning John." Notice the word. "What went ye out into the wilderness for to see?" Now, what did the people do? They went out. Because these messages weren't preached in the visible church. These messages were preached in the local churches. And everyone that was hearing these things that he was rebuking at this point had to go out to hear it. Out to halls, out to various places, out to places that are likened unto the wilderness, as it were. And what not only did you go out for, but where did you out to see? Again, we're reading verse 24. What went you out in the wilderness for? To see. Notice what he says. A reed shaken with the wind. Now, brothers and sisters, we know the Pharisees and Sadducees and leaders were in Jerusalem. So were they going out to see Pharisees and Sadducees? Absolutely not. Because those people were in Jerusalem, in the visible church, they were doing their work. And it says here, a reed shaken with the wind. A reed that every wind of doctrine or every political pressure or every worldly form of aggression can move and shake. That's what John was doing. John was in the wilderness. John was in a place where you had to go to hear him. John was not one that was swayed by the politics of the church or the church manual, the Sabbath school quarterly, or the theology of his day. He was not shaken by those things. He was as strong and certain as a needle of the pole, which is a direct contrast to what the Pharisees, Sadducees, elders, and scribes were, what the various ordained men of that day were. It goes on to say this in verse 25. But what went ye out for to see? Question mark. A man clothed in soft raiment? Behold, they that are gorgeously apparelled and live delicately are in king's courts. Again, a tremendous rebuke, but a clarifying statement again, that the Pharisees and the leaders and priests had the gorgeous robes, and they lived delicately. And these individuals had a kingly type of organization, a kingly type structure, a kingly type pomp to their ceremonies, not the simplicity, not the rough garment, not the dress reform that we saw, not the health reform that we saw in John. What went you out to see? Verse 26 says, what went you out for to see? A prophet? Yea, and I say unto you, much more than a prophet. Let's stop there. Here we see that Jesus puts forth a rebuke to the people, the rank and file people in the churches that had at this point come out to hear Jesus now, to come out to the Sea of Gennesaret and come out to the various places to see and hear Jesus. They were asked the question, basically, why did you go to these places that weren't in the synagogues? Why did you go to these places that weren't in the popular churches to hear this message, this stirring message, these present truth message, but you wanted to see kingly power, kingly organization. You want to see the soft raiment. Now we know clearly that raiment represents righteousness. Revelation teaches that. Isaiah teaches that. Raiment represents righteousness. The false righteousness of the scribes and leaders of the church of that day was even symbolically alluded to here, where they went out to see the formalism and the policies and the manual workings of the church. Even at John's meetings, they looked around and wondered why they didn't see the organization. They wondered if he was a part of ASI. They wondered about these things. Jesus said, why are you going out? Why are you going here and there? Why are you going from land to land, from sea to sea, to hear what you believe is present truth, but you're looking for the same type of evidence, the same type of witness, same type of fruit that are from the root of apostasy? Why? Because again, this was the reason why they could not hear and endure John's message. They want to hear some of this stirring message. It seemed like old-time religion, even though it was so convicting, they got baptized because of it. But they wanted to have a little bit of the apostate system and principles and teachings and methods with it too. Now, when we look at this, here we see, and we can read on concerning the greatness of John the Baptist, what he was to do, and that he was doing a work of a prophet. We want to go too far. We want to, again, make some application here. We want to even ask Pastor Tinsley, could you unpack some of this for us? Do we see from the scripture, from the spirit of prophecy, any application of this aspect in our day when we see that it seems like people are going to see something that will not be like John the Baptist was then or now? Can we unpack that for us for a minute?
Mm-hmm. You know, what's interesting as you were making those various points concerning the ministry of John and even later them being there at Christ. And what is interesting, what Christ is saying in this particular narrative that he's giving concerning John the Baptist's life, he's bringing into question the authority of John, because it was John that gave witness to Christ's ministry. It was John that said, "Behold, the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world." It was those in the soft raiment, the reeds. These were the ones that rejected Christ's ministry. We are told in the Desire of Ages that when the wise men and the shepherds had came bearing the message, looking for the Messiah, it was put off as a fanatical excitement. And she said, this laid the foundation for the rejection of Christ's ministry. And so Christ is here asking them to consider how John's work was in direct contrast to what they had previously been under, that which had previously brought them into this spiritual declension that they're in. And yet they recognize that they're not being edified, that they're not being guided spiritually. But yet when they come to John, they're still looking for John to give submission to that which led them or brought them in this deplorable condition.
So just to make a point there. So you're saying that what caused them to go out and made them so burned that they need to go out and hear this message was the very same thing they were looking for?
It was the very same thing they were looking for.
Mercy.
Because we see throughout Christ's ministry that there was this idea that at some particular time he would exalt himself. He would show himself to be what in their minds through the false teachings, to be what they had perceived this Messiah to be because of the teachings of the scribes and the Pharisees. And so when Christ fed the 5,000, the idea was, this is our king. He is going to lead us in battle. He can heal the wounded warriors as we take back Jerusalem.
Wait. So are you saying that basically they thought that Jesus did all this work, all this ministry, all this in this way to announce himself conference president?
Exactly.
Well, please go ahead. I don't want to get too far. Go ahead.
So this is the idea that haunted the disciples all the way through Christ's ministry, to where he said, not consider, he said, but beware of the leaven and the scribes of the Pharisees, which they understood to be these teachings, because it is these very teachings that is causing you not to be able to embrace what I'm doing. You are in jeopardy of rejecting this ministry because of the leaven of the scribes and the Pharisees, that which you have been taught from a child, and the way that you've been taught to look upon these buildings and these ceremonies and these forms. These are the very things that now has you in opposition to truly receiving Christ's ministry.
Well, thank God that's not happening today.
Well, the thing is, when we look at what is happening today, the same mode of ministry is being taken up with this idea that somehow or another, these messages are going to revive the General Conference leaders, and the working policies are going to start reflecting the sermons that we're preaching now. Because we believe that these sermons are to enlighten these men who in their minds believe that these men cannot be aware that these things are going on in the church. These men are not, do not understand that we have transgenders, elders, and these men cannot be aware that our pastors are going from seminary to these spiritualistic camps and learning how to get in contact with these fallen spirits. There's no way that our religious leaders understand that many of our chaplains in our various academies are pro same-sex marriage and pro-feminist movement. They can't hardly believe that. So I'm going to preach these messages, and eventually these men will understand the potency of these messages, and they are going to root all these things out of the church. And then Seventh Adventist Church will once again become a dominant denomination among all the churches of the land.
Let me interject something. So as Jesus is rebuking the people here, so would it have been wise for Jesus, in light of that, would it have been wise for Jesus to tell the people, hey, you know what? Go back to the synagogues and tell your leaders these things because they don't know. And, you can convert them and so on and so forth. Not knowing that these people had gone down to Alexandria, Egypt, and studied all the truths in Greek and so on, and had probably given up on them. Would it have been wise to tell people to follow that course, or to just try to raise a hand in Sabbath school and so on, where you're a part of a church or part of a synagogue at that time, where you have really no interest in what's going on other than to teach the pastor? Would that make sense?
Because you look at what Christ did with the woman at the well. She asked a very clear question. And that question was, do I stay here where I am, or do I go to Jerusalem?
Wait. Let's not zoom over that. Are you trying to say, that sounds like somewhat like an objective now. Are you trying to say that if Christ, when he converted that woman's heart, because he converted her heart, we know that spirit of prophecy is clear on that. If when her heart was converted, she was asking Christ whether I should stay here and worship here in this mountain, or whether I should go to the visible church and worship. That what you're saying? That she, that she would have went back into the regular lines, regular visible church, and sat down, and Jesus said, "Go there and do it."
Jesus said, "Go there and do it." But he made it clear that you will, because of this experience that you have had, you're not going to be accepted there. Neither will you be accepted in this environment that continues to hold on to religious tenets, but at the same time being open apostasy. Because where she was, they looked upon that well as sacred, but yet she was living in open sin. And so she felt that though I'm in open sin, because I know where the quote unquote well is, salvation is, I'm okay. And Jesus was telling her that this spiritual condition, or this environment that is okay with religious forms, but is not accepting of a true spiritual conversion. We recognize in Jerusalem, where they are concerned with forms but not true hard work, Christ said, neither condition will you be accepted. But the Father is seeking those who are going to worship him in spirit and in truth. And so throughout Christ's ministry, you find individuals, again, Christ looking to the disciples, saying, beware of the leaven and the scribes of the Pharisees. Matthew chapter 15, very passage we always like to quote in regards to the Sabbath. Why do your disciples not disregard? Why do they transgress the traditions of the elders? And his response was, why do your teachings transgress the law of God? Thus, if I was to work in harmony with your working policies, I would be sinning against God. And they were more concerned with you being in harmony with policy than their own salvation.
So which leads us to our second topic, would not be the professed present truth preachers that have read the spirit of prophecy, that are preaching the spirit of prophecy, that are reading the Bible, that are professing this greater light, wouldn't they be in a more unflattering light and a more dangerous position if they see and know all these things to be contrary to God's plan and transgressing his will to go forth and do them and teach others to do them the same?
Exactly.
It would be a worse position.
Worse position.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I'm going to make a point with Matthew 9, because that was our second point. Matthew 9, look at Matthew 9 quickly. Because in Matthew 9, we see Jesus' second rebuke concerning the same issue. In Matthew 9 and verse 14, and we'll get back to your thoughts. So hold that thought.
Right.
In Matthew 9 and verse 14, just as you talked about the disciples asking about the transgression of the elders, here again in Matthew 9, Jesus again brings to the forefront this contention when he's confronted with it. He was not looking for a war or division or a open animosity toward other people doing revival, because John's ministry was a true ministry. John's ministry was a ministry that was doing the work of God, and there was a blessing upon that ministry. It laid the foundation with Christ's ministry. But here, an open rift started to happen where the disciples of John, who should have known in a spiritual way the work they were doing and the preparatory work they were doing and who they were doing it for, the manner, the methods in which John worked, the methods of Jesus worked. But here in Matthew 9 verse 14, they were coming and trying to question Christ and his ministry and the work that the students of his school, if you will, were doing, based upon what the leaders of the church were doing, based upon policy, based upon the sanction of the umbrella of the church. Look what it says in Matthew 9:14. It says, then came to him the disciples of John, professed present truth preachers. saying, why do we and the Pharisees fast off, but thy disciples fast not? So in other words, here they're saying to Jesus and to the disciples, we as these disciples, we are professed present truth preachers, and we are in harmony with conference policy. We're in harmony with we're under the umbrella. We're doing this work now. They had gone out in the wilderness, per se, but they still saw themselves in connection under the auspices of the church. They still saw them being supported by the working policy of the division or the union or the denomination. They still saw themselves, and they started to now question the methods, the principles, and the work of Christ based upon what the church, the leaders, the elders, the policies said, because they want to be in harmony with those. And that is another rebuke. That's another platform that we have to deal with, because again, the people are blind to some of these issues, but they are blind not only because the Pharisees are teaching something, but also the supposed present truth preachers are again leading them back to the teaching of the elders, leading people back to the so-called regular or the Pharisee standard of fasting. Jesus fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and they were going to try to tell him and his disciples about fasting based upon conference policy. Unpack that for us, please.
Because the thing is, that point, these disciples come and say, listen, we have found a point where we can agree with the Pharisees. No, I don't agree with the music. I don't agree with their praise teams. But at that time, you could go stand in the hallway. But I have found points upon which we can agree with. And thus, those points upon which we agree, we are able to form an alliance. And brother, coming together, your disciples, us and the Pharisees, we can come together and we can finish the work a lot faster. This was the mindset. But now this is the thing we have to understand. Were the Pharisees deceived at this point, or were the present truth preachers deceived at this point? Because the Pharisees maintained their position
throughout the whole thing.
Throughout the whole thing. When you look at the ministry, when you look at the Desire of Ages under the chapter Levi and Matthew, the priest had rejected John's ministry, and they were now willing to use John's disciples to cast discredit upon Christ's ministry. So they were willing to stoop to a level to even use John's ministry, John's disciples, to try to draw a reproach over Christ's ministry to sustain their own. So at the end of the day, they would have done with John's disciples the same thing they did with Judas, because their purpose was to destroy Christ's ministry.
So it's more effective to use a so-called present truth preacher to do their dirty work than to do it themselves.
Exactly. Because now they realize, you read Desire of Ages, they realized that they were losing their hold upon the people. They could no longer just come and get on and speak freely. They did not have the footprint to be able to come before the people or the respect of the people to basically just speak openly about what they thought about this ministry that was casting such a glaring light on their apostasy. But if they could work through the supporting ministries to accomplish their end, they'll be willing to use these supporting ministries. Now, the interesting thing is, when you look at the position that many of the supporting ministries are taken today, is no different from that of Jesus' brothers, is no different from that even of the disciples to some extent, because prior to the cross, they were unconverted. They were still looking for this exaltation of the denomination to be brought forth. They were looking for this utopian experience where everyone could come together and agree on religious tenets, but not having the experience of conversion. And so what's happening is today, we would rather come before the people with this false idea of unity. Let's just let the people see we're unified, but in spirit and in life, there is stark differences. And so this formality, John tore down, and Jesus now comes in this same story and said, listen, to John's disciples, you cannot put new wine in old bottles. And this is where she begins to outline in the book Desire of Ages. she begins to show that Jesus did not come to build a bridge between John's ministry and that of the Pharisees. It wasn't as though Christ came and said, John was a little extreme. There were some things that John did that should have been left out. John didn't have to, call out Herodias' wife like that in front of everybody. John didn't have to tell these dignitaries that he was not going to baptize them. Who is he to judge someone's heart when they're standing in the baptismal line? John did not have to do these things publicly that he did. Therefore, now I am going to dwell chiefly upon the righteousness of my Father, and I will ignore all of the sins in the church, in the religious leaders, and I'm going to focus solely upon the righteousness of my Father. And in focusing upon that, there will be a uniting of the Pharisees, John the Baptist, and us, and then we can present ourselves to the world as a united front. The work can finish, and the Spirit of God can fall upon us, and we can waltz into heaven.
Okay, now let me stop. So that platform that you say that people would have been more accepting of Jesus if he would have done that, but isn't that the same platform that the proposed or supposed present preachers are presenting today as revival information?
Exactly, because
those are making apologies for the more so-called uncooperative, supposedly individuals, those that are attacking the church or so on and so forth, as they call attacking the church. But their position is they want to dwell on righteousness by faith and the Father's love and so on and so forth. And by ignoring the policy and dwelling upon Christ,
it will go away.
As if Christ did not dwell upon these issues. In other words, they are following another Christ, I guess.
Exactly, because again, the work of the Spirit is to convict us of sin. But nonetheless, when we look at this, Christ says you cannot put new wine into old bottles. That understanding, she clearly shows us here in the book Desire of Ages. I'll just read.
Okay. While you're going to read that, I want to make a note that also that statement that you mentioned is a direct quote from Matthew 9 and verse 16. After Jesus says that verse 13, Jesus talks about go and learn what meaneth I will have mercy. They told him, why do your disciples not fast like the Pharisees? Jesus said, hey, verse 12, they that behold need not a physician, but they that are sick, go and learn what meaneth I have mercy. Then verse 16, he drops down and says, if you really want to understand, since you don't seem to understand what I'm saying about this truth concerning what we're trying to do in this time as opposed to fasting, he says you cannot put a new cloth on an old garment. What they thought would be a concession of Christ, I know you're going to read that, a concession of Christ or a coming in line with the righteousness of the Pharisees. Because remember, Jesus said, well, that the righteousness of the Pharisees, don't do what they do. But John's disciples said, hey, fast like they fast. Let's have a unity. And what many people are presenting as opposed to the true work of John the Baptist as John 17 unity is nothing more than patchwork apostasy. It's patchwork apostasy, trying to sew together two types of work that cannot do, or try to present their formal, regular line, denomination endorsed ministry with a little present truth piece of cloth sewed over the great hole in their substance, and present this patchwork apostasy as present truth and a revival information ministry. It is deception. Unless you can lead the scripture with clarity, you won't see it though. What do you read from?
Now, notice this passage. This is Desire of Ages 278. The message of John the Baptist was not to be interwoven with the tradition and supposition, and not to be woven with tradition and supposition. An attempt to blend the pretense of the Pharisees with the devotion of John would only make more evident the breach between them. Nor could the principles of Christ's teaching be united with the forms of Phariseeism. Next statement. Christ was not to close up the breach that had been made by the teachings of John. He would make more distinct the separation between the old and the new. Now, this is a very interesting point that we come to. Look at the condition of the church today. We were having this conversation earlier, and I said this statement. If you go back to the 70s, in Adventism, go back to the 70s, 80s, you begin to see that this departure in worship and in the reforms that God had given to us. And why have the reforms departed? Because the spirituality had departed. You see this in the worship, in the music, and in the conduct of the worship styles, from Oakwood to all of our institutions. And the interesting thing that I noted there was Elder C.D. Brooks, God rest his soul, E. Cleveland, E.C. Ward, and Elder Rainey. Many of you don't know about him. Charles Dudley and all these individuals. They were all conservative. Their position on the apostasy that come into the church was, except E.C. Ward, was silence. E. Cleveland, C.D. Brooks dealt chiefly upon doctrines. The second coming of Christ, mark of the beast, don't eat chicken and pork, chiefly upon the doctrines. And Joe Cruz was around at that time. These men dealt, E. Cleveland, chiefly upon doctrines. Elder Rock, chiefly upon doctrines. E.C. Ward was the single preacher that talked about various things that was not acceptable to God in the sanctuary, in the church. Now, you say, why are we dealing with that? Because this approach of just dealing with our message and leaving these creeping compromises alone only allowed the chasm and the cancer to grow and to get bigger and bigger, and now we're staring at in the face. So what men are attempting to do, I'm going to focus largely on the righteousness of Christ. I'm going to do like Hophni and Phinehas. I see that I'm not, the churches abhors the worship of God, but I'm going to go and get the sanctuary. I'm going to go and get the Ark of the Covenant. And I'm going to bring the Ark of the Covenant among the people, and look at the shouting and the revival that's taking place among them, even though they cannot stand the worship of God. But to see this relic is somehow giving us an idea that there is a revival taking place among us. And what has happened through this idea of I'm going to ignore these things and I'm going to focus on doctrines, we've seen it done already. And the cancer and the chasm between righteousness and between God's standard and the standard of the church is growing wider and wider and wider. This is what John's disciples began to figure out in their own minds. Well, John was a little extreme in not working with the Pharisees. And so now that John is out of the picture, we have found that we can work with the Pharisees now. And they came to Christ with that same policy. Christ says, listen, you cannot put new wine into old bottles. What was he telling them? Same thing he told Nicodemus. You must be born again. Mm-hmm. Because while you came out into the wilderness, you did not understand the spirit and the motivation that caused John to be in the wilderness. Mm. They just came along for the ride. They saw the excitement. They attached themselves to it. Yes, they were learning how to pray, but they did not understand the spiritual condition of the nation. And thus, when John left, it was so easy for them to go back to that which John testified was a deadly viper. It was a poison. Their teachings was a poison to be shunned. He called them vipers. Who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? And thus he's telling the people that their doctrines, where does this poison come from? Not from their feet or their hands, comes from their mouth. Their teachings was a deadly poison to be shunned. But the disciples, they didn't understand that. They felt, I'll just go stand in the hallway. Once the music is over, then I'll come back in and I'll participate as much as I can. And I know everyone stands up now and waves their hands in the air, but I'll fall on my knees, not even realizing that you're trying to put new wine into old bottles. And this is what John warned of. This is what Christ is warning us of today. And we're finding the very same thing with all the various ministries. We mentioned this ad nausea when we talked about, we could talk about Hartman, and maybe you could expand on that. GYC. GYC started out as Generation Youth Conference. What happened? Someone stepped in, said you must change your name, thus changing your identity. We will give you a logo. We will now dictate and tell you who can and who cannot be a part of this. And now that we have gotten control of it, all the conferences, to a great degree, have rejected the General Youth Conference. But now that the conference have stepped in and remodeled the cause, everyone is accepting of it. But again, it's trying to put new wine into old bottles.
Let's even further unpack and break that down for a minute as we have our last few moments here. When you go back and you look at history, you got to study Adventist history. There have been various times where people have tried to the best of their understanding, stimulate or promote revival formation. Back when you go back years ago to the time of, let's even say the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and so on. You had W.D. Frazee. Some people may know the name W.D. Frazee. He was the founder of Wildwood. Wildwood is, even to this day, operating as a lifestyle center. They have a hospital there and so on. W.D. Frazee, in his day, was a regular Adventist minister, great consecration, and he felt a burden from reading testimonies and reading Ellen White's writings to really stimulate revival information through medical missionary work. He read the quotation how medical missionary work would be the final work, and I'm sure he was deeply influenced by people connected with the Madison School and a lot of the teachings that came through those individuals that started that movement that Ellen White said was to last for time and for eternity. Men like Julius Gilbert White, who gave amazing talks and did a great work in health lines, educating a whole generation of evangelists that would go out. Well, W.D. Frazee eventually felt so compelled that he started doing traveling medical missionary bands, just like the Spirit of Prophecy says. And he was able to develop a support base of not only supporters financially, but also he had nurses and doctors that would travel with him as he went, especially through the South, and did revivals. And it was under the conference, went around doing revivals. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure if you remember Samuel Thomas Sr. when we were in Huntsville. His wife and her family was baptized by W.D. Frazee, doing a meeting in her little town, I think somewhere in Alabama, some little town, maybe Mississippi, Alabama. They went throughout all these dark counties, doing a southern work, as the Spirit of Prophecy says, doing a medical missionary work. Many were baptized. Eventually, W.D. Frazee wanted to take a step further and saw that it was in this form of reform, you need outposts. So he wanted to establish this outpost. He taught and lived and believed that which he understood. Eventually, the Wildwood Complex, or the Wildwood Sanitarium, was established. Now, when W.D. Frazee established Wildwood, what he was trying to do and what people thought he was doing were largely two different things. And in that time, it was much more, what's the word I'm looking for? To do a self-supporting work or having anything that was not directly in the conference was much more aggressively attacked then than it is now. And it could be, as opposed to our digital age. But I want to narrow this down and cut to the chase. W.D. Frazee started Wildwood, and the brethren believed that he was doing something out of hand. They believed that he wasn't following duly appointed order and so on. And eventually, W.D. Frazee had his credentials removed. They removed his credentials as Adventist minister because they believed that he was doing something nefarious, even though he believed in the conference, he believed in all the various teachings of Ellen White, he believed in the brethren. Many of them went to school with him. But they, through some process, found some reason by which to defrock or remove his credentials. If you go back and look, there was a man by the name of George Vanderman, who was also a very, very dear and longtime friend of W.D. Frazee, that by off chance heard that by and by, or as they would say, that W.D. Frazee left the church. This is what they were saying. He couldn't believe it. He knew him. And because he was probably the most noted and face recognized Adventist at the time, he had great influence. He went down to Georgia to see, or the area of Georgia where Wildwood is, that border area, to see what was going on. And when he went and saw the land and what they were doing and the various different people there, he was amazed that the work was going on. And he worked very diligently to let the brethren know that what Frazee was doing was not against the work, but not against the forwarding of the work or the brethren. It was in harmony with the spirit of prophecy. It was a good work. There was even a young man and his wife down there that so deeply impressed him when he saw the lectures and talks that he was giving, that he actually brought him under his arm and brought him to work with him. And eventually he would take over. It is written, his name was Mark Finley. They were at Wildwood as students. Him and his wife were as students. That's why you see her do all those health talks and those health classes and those large health classes. She was trained at Wildwood under Frazee. This history shows the connection. That's why even when W.D. Frazee died, Mark Finley did his funeral. They were connected. But people don't know the history behind and the suffering that went on with Frazee because of that. Now, when many people read the writings of Frazee, they see some of the things he says about working along with the brethren, working under the church, and have everything under the conference. Do you believe that W.D. Frazee was in all understanding some of the quotations that we've shared and some of the videos that we have? There's no reason to try and vilify W.D. Frazee, but W.D. Frazee was under tremendous pressure to not be seen as being antagonistic toward the church, and to make sure that the brethren did not think that he was doing something that was unconnected or unsanctioned by the brethren. Many of his talks, even though there's many things talking about reform, there was a tremendous emphasis to try and place everything in the context of the conference, when clearly Ellen White said, clearly the work that was to be done in the South and that was done through Madison and other schools would be done self-supporting. Ellen White clearly said, and that not everything was to be under the conference. Many people that followed Frazee's guidelines and were students of his were very careful. They were taught to be very careful to not cause the brethren to think that you're doing something that's against them. There was a tremendous influence. Now, among many people that were influenced by Frazee, there are many leading families that continue to do a work similar to Wildwood and establish other centers that would be lifestyle and sanitarium-like centers that exist to this day. You had names like Thrash. You had names like Lee. Most people don't know about the Lees. Most people have heard of the Standishes. The Standishes, the Lees, the Thrash, all these individuals were very, very, very moved by the teachings of Frazee and this idea of doing this educational work, this health work, connected together to cause revival formation. We know that the Thrash opened Uchee Ponds. It exists to this day. We know that Weimar was also started out in California. And most people don't know that Elder Standish was the president of Weimar before the president of Hartman. Now, you well know, if you know anything about Adventist history, that Weimar eventually closed because Weimar became more and more under pressure to be in harmony with the other accredited schools of California, to be under the control more and more of the conference, to be more and more in line with other schools, even to the point where before Weimar, you and I know this because we were there in California, they started teaching Greek and Latin there and trying to get worldly accreditation right before the whole support base dried up and they went under. Now, Elder Standish was long gone. He had left Weimar, and learning from the lessons he had learned from Weimar, he went and established Hartman. Now, guess how Elder Standish, who still is a credentialed Seventh-day Adventist minister, guess how he started and established Hartman? As a self-supporting institution. A self-supporting institution. Not only self-supporting, but a self-supporting institution that receives tithe. Not only a self-supporting institution, not only a self-supporting institution that receives tithe, that also has its own camp meetings, that has its own publication, created its own Sabbath school quarterly. I mean, all these things were done by Hartman. They started a movement, and they got millions of dollars of support for this movement of revival and reformation along educational lines, and people sent their youth to be trained to finish the work. But again, brothers and sisters, What went ye out in the wilderness to see? What did the Hartman leaders go out in the wilderness to see? Why did they start this self-supporting work and then have people come and take pastoral education, pastoral classes, pastoral evangelism at Hartman, only to tell them, well, you got to go to Andrews now. You spend all this money there, but you have to go if you want to have a true work, don't tell them to go out, start churches, start baptizing, start teaching like John the Baptist did. You have to go to Andrews and get a job at the conference. They were self-supporting. They received tithe, but they were teaching people to go back to the conference and get truly educated to work within conference lines. And we know that Hartman now is trying to do its best to get back under the umbrella of the General Conference and ASI and to be a non-tithe receiving rank and file entity, just like Wildwood or UG Pines or any of the others. Brothers and sisters, what went they out in the wilderness to see? And how is it that now they have an idea of trying to be in harmony with the same principles that they had left long ago, or the standards left long ago? Did they really understand what they were moving away from? Or is it that after they came out to see something different, came out to receive money to do a work different, came out to create their own publishing house and make books and so on, to try and stem the tide of revival information that was being ebbed out and create a tremendous bulwark against apostasy? How is it because they truly didn't understand what it really meant not to sew new cloth on old garment, that they refused to have chapel services, Sabbath services? They wanted to send their youth out to the various churches where they were persecuted and asked not to come back, or they were, to a great degree, very, very tenuous situation in the local church because they did not want them there. They didn't want their long skirts and lack of eating our potluck. They didn't want them to go out and help out with the youth program. As hard as they tried, they were out of place, trying to fit in this new situation. Brothers and sisters, what went they out in the world to see? And how is it that now they see it all together differently? Do you think that this is just a Hartman issue, or is it a Hartman issue, a GYC issue? With all these movements that we see, they want to do a revival work, a John the Baptist work, supposed to preach present truth under ASI, under the NAD, and by the way, the NAD is the one that's now getting ready to have all these unions take a new organization to another level. So the organization they're trying to be under, because ASI working policy, NAD working policy, is virtually identical. The entity that all these self-supporting groups are trying to be under is going to be the main agency to bring severe persecution and bring them in line. Medical missionary work? No. Allied health. Don't call yourself a medical missionary. Allied health. And unless you get training with our institution, or you're a medical doctor from Georgetown or something like that, you can't do any health talks in our church. It is coming. What will happen to ASI? Support them. What will happen to all these things? Is it just a idea of the disciples anciently going out to see and not really understanding? Or was it an issue today, brother?
It's an issue. It's an issue today. And with this understanding, many that you and I have talked to privately on phone conversations, inboxing, and Pastor Cofer, Pastor Tinsley, I want to do something. I don't know what to do, yada, yada, yada. And eventually, because of the pressure that comes from not being accepted, of the negative whispering, they take a different turn. And they still try to be cordial to us. They still try to inbox us and send us messages every now and then. But you see them taking the approach of John the Baptist's disciples, that we have found something alongside these men. And the reason why many of them, again, if you study the history of GYC, Heartland, all these other institutions, as was just stated, the purpose was they saw that the torch had gone out in the sanctuary. They saw that the candlestick was no longer burning. Eli was physically handicapped. The ministry that he was over was spiritually inept, and it could not do it. And for this reason, they felt a burning within their hearts to do something. But rather than following on to know the Lord, rather than Again, considering the tower before they built it, the excitement of being a preacher superseded the falling upon their knees as John the Baptist did. Recognizing that true experience, having that true experience in the heart, seeing God's people deceived in their sins, praying and pleading with God to free them from their iniquity, and realizing that they, by the providence of God, had been placed upon that platform. And like Ezekiel, they were not to be afraid of their faces, but they were to go forth. And God said, I will make thy forehead adamant stone against theirs. Because they did not sit with Christ and have that experience, they thought that they could intellectually create a ministry that would not appear threatening, but at the same time, they will be seeking, like termites, to undermine the very thing that they say is an apostasy. And on one hand, they're holding it up, and at the same time, they're acting as though to their naive followers, those who naively are accepting present truth, that, hey, we are trying to finish the work, but they are holding up the very system that they're acting as termites, trying to destroy. This is the ministry. When you look at the rebuke that was started in the beginning, Christ had a rebuke for the people as well as for the ministry. He rebuked his own disciples. The very men that you are trying to work in harmony with are some of the greatest enemies of God's cause and his truth. And so it is today. Some of the very individuals that people have found convenient to work with are some of the very individuals who are destroying ministries, who are destroying this work. We have sat on many of board meetings. We have sat in many of conference rooms with some of the names and individuals that we have named in previous videos. And we have seen their attempts from the Rainbow Coalition, was it Rainbow
Project? That's
Rainbow Project, from the regional coordinators and all of these various things, regional conferences, all of these various things, sat in all these meetings and listened to all these men vote and try to present these things in a very logical form of why we need these things, only to be shut down, only to turn right around and the next meeting do a song and dance for the very people that they felt was destroying the work. We've been there, done that, and now God again has raised up this work in this pivotal time. And you and I, by the grace of God, must study to show ourselves approved unto God. Not picking quotations here and there, but picking up these testimonies, picking up the conflict series, and praying and asking God, please, Lord, send forth laborers into your field. And God will give you a burden. He must roll that burden upon you.
Amen. Well, what more shall we say? For our study tonight, let's end there, because there's so much more to say, but we want to make it so that people can digest these things. This was a mouthful. And again, what went ye out in the wilderness to see? Let's not be among those, brothers and sisters, who, when Jesus showed them what? Identified the wrong methods, the wrong principles, the wrong idea of 11 o'clock worship, the wrong idea of evangelism, the wrong idea of finishing the work, or doing self-supporting work, or doing a revival work. Let's not be among those who are looking for true preachers to operate in a way or under the control and authority and blessing of those who the Spirit of prophecy clearly says are trying to hinder and destroy the work for this time. Let us be wise. Let us be spiritually awake. Let us be full of eye salve to see sin and iniquity and apostasy in any guise, whether it be in us or anywhere, and let us work for the destruction of it, that the gospel may have its perfect rule. Let's have a word of prayer as we close this important session. Heavenly Father, again, we thank you for all the entities, ministries, names, places that were called, the fields of labor. We pray that you would work by your mighty hand to bring revival and reformation to every place, point, and person. Lord, those living and dead mentioned, everywhere you see that revival and reformation has been moved, dear God, go to the places where these individuals, these men have gone, and help there to be a fulfillment of your word, God, according to your word. fulfill your word in every place. Do a work that, in spite of the obstacles that we see to the left and the right, north and south, we pray that you would do a work in spite of these obstacles in us and through us. Help us to walk through these walls and these objections and even mental barriers as walls with untempered mortar. Please, dear God, work upon your people. We pray that you would bring a spirit of conversion, revival, and reformation in the hearts of present truth preachers as well as the common people, that both these entities might have revival, is our prayer with thanksgiving. In Jesus' name, amen.